As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Once upon a time, factory chimneys in Detroit and Toledo were a symbol of American strength. Their rumbling set the pace for millions of families, and the Made in the USA label was more than just a slogan. It was a promise of stability, confidence, and a bright future. But today, that pride is crumbling before our eyes. Empty parking lots, rusty fences, and silent workshops have become the new reality. The auto giants that shaped American identity for decades are rapidly leaving the country, and they are doing so not out of a desire for change, but out of a need to survive.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
What happened? Why are factories, once the heart of global industry, closing down and production moving abroad? The answer lies in decisions that were supposed to protect the American economy but have become a burden on it. The introduction of large-scale tariffs under the slogan of saving jobs was a blow from which the industry has not recovered. The cost of manufacturing within the US skyrocketed. Cars, once an affordable dream for the middle class, became a luxury. Families who had been counting on a new car suddenly realized that the price was beyond their means. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, in Canada, the story unfolded differently. There, they offered a simple formula: cheap energy, generous government incentives, and predictable policies. The result was immediate. Major automakers began to move key production facilities there. Jobs, taxes, technology, everything that was supposed to be the backbone of American cities moved to Ontario and Quebec.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
For ordinary people, it was a disaster. In cities where generations had worked in the same factories, a void emerged. Stores are closing, services are emptying, families are forced to leave their homes. What had been perceived as unshakable for decades turned out to be an illusion. Promises to protect jobs turned into mass layoffs. The American dream is turning into a disturbing nightmare. But this is not just the story of the automotive industry. It is a signal that other companies have already heard. Manufacturers of food, beverages, and essential goods have all begun to adjust their plans, moving operations to places with less risk and lower costs. And if today we are talking about cars and batteries, tomorrow could affect any sector. It's not just jobs that are at stake. It's America's status as an industrial power. Will the country that until recently dictated the rules of the global economy be able to maintain its influence? Or will others take its place? This question is troubling not only ordinary citizens, but also analysts, investors, and politicians around the world.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Today, we are witnessing a turning point. Policies designed to protect have become a threat. Decisions that were supposed to restore strength have resulted in weakness. And now the main question remains: how long can America maintain its image as an industrial giant if the symbols of its power are leaving the country? The answer to this question will determine not only the fate of the automotive industry, but also the future of the entire global economy. The U.S. automotive industry, which until recently was considered the benchmark for technological progress and economic power, is now going through a period that many experts call the most dramatic in the last half-century. Just a few years ago, no one could have imagined that companies like Tesla and Ford, symbols of the American breakthrough, would begin to move key production facilities outside the country. But by the middle of the decade, it became clear that processes set in motion within the US economy itself, together with political decisions, had turned what was once an undeniable advantage into a source of heavy losses. And it was at this moment that it became clear that the crisis could no longer be hidden by dry reports and promises from officials. Tesla, a company that just yesterday was held up as an example of the driving force behind the Green Revolution, announced the largest drop in car deliveries in its history.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
In the second quarter, the number of cars shipped fell so sharply that Wall Street analysts called it a black mark for the entire industry. Official data showed a record annual decline, but the figures that did not make it into the press releases were even more alarming. In some regions of the US, sales fell by 40%, dealer warehouses were overflowing with unsold cars, and many buyers simply backed out of deals at the last minute due to soaring prices and unstable interest rates. Ford, another giant that for decades was considered a guarantor of jobs in Michigan and Ohio, found itself in an even more difficult situation. Quality problems had been accumulating within the company for several years, and in the first half of the year alone, the number of recalls exceeded 2 million cars. For comparison, in the early 2000s, such figures were considered a disaster, but today they have become part of the new norm. But it's not just about individual companies. The situation in the American auto industry has become systemic. Factories that were once bustling with life began to close one after another. In Detroit, a city where the noise of production halls was the heart of the entire economy, dozens of buildings stand empty. Where tens of thousands of workers once labored, silence now reigns. Drone photos show huge parking lots lined with rusty building frames and nearby neighborhoods with boarded-up windows and empty stores. Economists warn that every closed production line affects not only workers but also entire supply chains. These include thousands of small businesses, from parts manufacturers to snack bars near factories, which existed only because of the factory rhythm. Against the backdrop of these events, companies began to look for a way out. And it turned out to be not in new technologies or innovations, but in geography. Increasingly, managers turned their attention to Canada. The situation there was completely different. The Canadian government, observing the difficulties of its neighbors, acted decisively. Instead of endless debates in Parliament, they offered automakers specific conditions, stable energy rates, tax breaks, subsidies, and fast bureaucratic processing of projects. In Quebec, Tesla gained access to hydroelectric power at rates that were half those in the US. In Ontario, Ford signed an agreement that provided it with hundreds of millions of dollars in direct support.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
But even more important was that Canada offered companies something that had long been lacking in the US: predictability. In America, new rules and tariffs were introduced almost every year, creating an atmosphere of chaos. Manufacturers did not know what the tax regime would be in 2 months, let alone a year. In Canada, everything looked different: 5- and 10-year plans. No sudden changes, unions ready to negotiate without protracted strikes. It is not surprising that corporations began to opt for such a quiet harbor. That's when the mass relocation of production began. Ford announced that its key Super Duty heavy pickup truck line would now operate in Ontario. Tesla launched a project to build a new battery manufacturing complex in Quebec, investing more than $1 billion there. This came as a real shock to the US. After all, we were not talking about auxiliary divisions, but about the heart of the companies, their main products. On the American side of the border, the consequences were immediate. In Michigan, the closure of the Ford plant left nearly 8,000 people out of work. Another 10,000 employees of related companies lost their orders. In Nevada, where Tesla had previously developed its own battery production, some of the sites were mothballed. Workers, many of whom had moved to the state for the promised green energy revolution, found themselves in limbo. Meanwhile, the opposite was happening in Canada. New jobs were opening up, training programs were being launched, and local colleges began retraining students to meet the needs of automotive companies. Towns that had previously been quiet came to life. New residential neighborhoods, schools, and even hospitals appeared in Ontario, built with tax revenues from car manufacturers. While American cities were emptying, Canadian cities were filling with new life.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Economists calculated that every job created in Canada's automotive industry automatically took away 2 jobs in the United States. And if the trend continues in the coming years, by the end of the decade, America could lose up to 200,000 more jobs directly or indirectly related to the auto industry. For a country where car culture has always been part of the national identity, this sounds like a death sentence. Critics within the US argue that the situation could have been different. If tariff policy had been more flexible, if the state had not overburdened companies with bureaucracy and additional costs, the outcome could have been different. But today it is too late to ask questions. The factories are closed, the contracts are signed, the equipment has been shipped out. All that remains on the streets of American cities are memories of a time when the noise of conveyor belts was a symbol of hope, not a symbol of the past. And yet there is one thing that makes the situation even more painful. The departure of Tesla and Ford to Canada is perceived not only as an economic event, but also as a blow to national pride. After all, for decades these companies have embodied the American breakthrough, American strength, and the American dream. And now, as they build their future outside the country, millions of people are beginning to wonder, can America still consider itself an industrial giant if its symbols are now working on foreign soil? These questions remain unanswered for now, but one thing is clear. The crisis in the US auto industry and the mass exodus of production to Canada are not temporary difficulties, but the beginning of a new era in which the familiar balance of power may change forever.
Specifically, under the new US approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
When Washington announced the introduction of large-scale tariffs of 25%, it was presented as a historic step. The authorities promised that American factories would now be protected from foreign competitors, workers would have confidence in the future, and the country itself would once again become the industrial heart of the world. But the reality turned out to be the opposite. The tariffs, intended to be a shield, became a burden, and their consequences very quickly hit the most vulnerable segments of society. Car manufacturers began calculating their losses almost immediately. Already in the second quarter, Ford reported additional expenses in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and forecasts for 2025 paint a picture of losses exceeding $2 billion. Tesla reported an extra $300 million in just one quarter, but the bare figures are just the tip of the iceberg. The main blow was to production costs. According to industry analysts, each car manufactured in the US has risen in price by about $6,000. This is not an advertising gimmick or an exaggeration, it is simply the result of a chain of layers, where each imported part was subject to additional duties. On average, the final price of cars on the market has risen by $4,000 to $5,000. For ordinary families, this was a turning point. People who had planned to replace their cars every 5 to 6 years postponed their purchases indefinitely. Banks recorded an increase in car loan defaults, and some regional credit unions reported that, for the first time in a decade, the number of applications for new cars had almost halved. Against the backdrop of this consumer shock, a new mood began to emerge in cities. Car dealerships, which until recently were overflowing with customers, now stand half empty. Salespeople admit that the number of deals closed has fallen by a third. One of the largest dealerships in Illinois closed for the first time in 40 years of operation. This is not an isolated case, but part of a broader picture in which the American dream of owning a car has become a luxury. People who for decades associated buying a new car with a symbol of stability are now forced to settle for used cars or give up the idea of changing their transportation altogether. For the workers themselves, the consequences have been even more devastating. The closure of factories means not only a loss of wages, but also the destruction of an entire way of life. In cities across the Midwest, tens of thousands of people have been out of work for months. And while people used to be able to count on finding a new job at a nearby factory, that option is now gone. In a number of counties, unemployment rose to double digits for the first time since the 2008 crisis. Local authorities began distributing food stamps, and launching temporary employment programs, but the scale of the problem proved to be much more serious. Social services are seeing an increase in requests for psychological help, and the number of family bankruptcies has risen. Some analysts are already comparing the current situation to the deindustrialization of the 1980s, when entire regions turned into a rust belt.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
The situation has become particularly acute due to the contrast between official statements and everyday reality. Officials continued to assure the public that the tariffs were an investment in the future, while families saw that their incomes were not even enough to cover their basic needs. Prices for spare parts, repairs, and insurance have risen. Cars, which had previously been a source of pride, became a heavy financial burden. In the suburbs, it was increasingly common to see old cars with for sale stickers on their driveways, as people tried to get rid of their debts and get at least some cash. The situation was complicated by the fact that tariffs hit not only the auto industry, but also all related industries. Metal, glass, electronics, everything became more expensive. This automatically made repairs more expensive, and insurance companies began to take into account the increased cost of spare parts. As a result, even those who had not planned to buy a new car found themselves trapped. Any accident, even a minor one, became a serious problem, as replacement parts cost twice as much as before. For millions of Americans, this was an additional blow to the family budget. At the community level, the consequences are even more dramatic. In cities where factories closed, small businesses began to close rapidly. Cafes near factory gates, shoe repair shops, small stores, all of them existed thanks to factory wages. When those wages disappeared, the flow of customers dried up. In some areas, the number of closed retail outlets increased by 40% in 1 year. Economists call this the domino effect. One fall leads to dozens of others. But the most devastating thing is the feeling of betrayal. Workers who for decades believed that their labor was the foundation of American prosperity now feel cheated. In their view, tariffs were supposed to protect them and restore confidence in the future. In reality, they have become victims of a policy that has made manufacturing too expensive and purchasing too burdensome. People are holding rallies, writing petitions, and demanding explanations, but so far they have only heard vague promises of long-term benefits. A new line of division is emerging in society. Those who have lost their jobs blame both the government and corporations. Those who still have their jobs live in constant fear that tomorrow their factory will be next on the list to close. Even within families, conflicts are beginning to arise. The older generation, accustomed to stability, accuses young people of giving up too soon, while young people openly declare that America can no longer give them what it promised their parents. And here the hardest truth emerges: the tariffs and economic measures that were supposed to strengthen the country have become an instrument of destruction of the social fabric. People are losing not only their jobs and incomes, but also their sense of belonging, confidence in the future, and faith in the very idea of made in the USA. If in the past the car was a symbol of national pride, now it has become a symbol of inaccessibility and loss.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The economic crisis is always measured not only by the numbers in reports, but also by human destinies. Today, these fates form a grim mosaic: families selling their homes to pay off debts, young people leaving for Canada in search of work, cities turning into deserts, and a country beginning to realize that its industrial power is no longer a guarantee of prosperity. And this is precisely what makes the crisis in the auto industry and the consequences of tariff policy not just an economic problem, but a social catastrophe, the effects of which America will feel for many years to come. Against the backdrop of chaos in the American auto industry, Canada began to look like an island of stability. What Washington presented as job protection and economic strengthening turned out to be a historic opportunity for Ottawa. The Canadian authorities acted quickly and decisively. A package of subsidies, cheap energy, and a transparent regulatory system created conditions that manufacturers in the US could only dream of. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Against the backdrop of constant political battles in America, Canadian predictability became a major competitive advantage. Corporate executives, accustomed to working with multi-billion-dollar projects, understood perfectly well that it was not only the amount of support that mattered to them, but also the guarantee that the rules of the game would not change in a month. This played a key role, and Canada gradually became a new center of attraction for industry.